When 100 tons of 99.99% pure gold rolled into London, the city didn't blink, it gasped. The convoy of armored trucks, flanked by silent sirens and black-clad security, snaked through the financial district like a procession of judgment. Pedestrians froze. Traders stared. Cameras clicked. But inside the marble walls of the Bank of England, panic was already blooming. This wasn't just gold. It was a challenge. The shipment had come from abroad, unannounced, uninvited, and unmistakably real. Each bar stamped, certified, and gleaming with a purity that mocked the institution's own reserves. Within hours, whispers began to swirl. Why does this gold look cleaner? Why does it weigh more? Why does it test purer? By sunset, the whispers had turned into headlines. The bank's spokespeople scrambled. Analysts were silenced. But the questions couldn't be buried under press releases. Not this time. Because this gold wasn't just brighter, it was louder. It screamed of accountability. It dared the establishment to compare. And when independent metallurgists began testing the bank's own reserves, the results didn't just raise eyebrows. They detonated trust. The public, already weary from inflation and austerity, now stared at their screens in disbelief. Could the oldest, most revered financial institution in Britain be sitting on counterfeit wealth? Could the vaults that symbolized centuries of empire be filled with something less than gold? The convoy had arrived with silence, but it left behind a roar. And yet, the real shock wasn't the gold. It wasn't the purity. It wasn't even the scandal. It was what the bank had been hiding all along, and who had finally decided to speak. For centuries, the Bank of England stood as a monument to financial supremacy, a fortress of trust, a symbol of British pride. Its vaults weren't just filled with gold, they were filled with legacy. Generations of empire, war, and diplomacy had passed through its marble halls. To question its integrity was to question the very spine of Western finance. But now, that spine was cracking. The arrival of 100 tons of 99.99% pure gold wasn't just a logistical marvel. It was a statement, a challenge, a mirror held up to an institution that had long operated behind velvet curtains and polished press releases. And when the purity of that gold outshone the bank's own reserves, the illusion began to unravel. This wasn't just about metallurgy. It was about meaning. Gold has always been more than metal. It's the heartbeat of global confidence. It backs currencies, anchors economies, and whispers promises of stability. When that promise is broken, when the gold is fake, diluted, or misrepresented, the consequences ripple far beyond one city. Markets don't wait for apologies. Within hours, whispers turned to tremors. Traders in New York, Frankfurt, and Tokyo began recalculating risk. Central banks quietly initiated audits. Nations that had stored their wealth in London's vaults began asking uncomfortable questions. And behind closed doors, the word contagion echoed like a warning bell. For the British public, the betrayal cut deeper. This was their institution, their pride, their legacy. And now, it stood accused of deception, not by tabloids or conspiracy theorists, but by the purity of truth itself. Immigrant families who had trusted the pound, progressive voices who had defended the system, and everyday citizens who had weathered austerity, all watched as the veil was lifted. And beneath it, they saw something rotten. The gold had arrived with silence, but its presence screamed of accountability. It dared the world to look closer, to question what had long been accepted. And as the scandal grew, so did the stakes. Because what happens next doesn't just shake London, it sends tremors through every vault on earth. For over 3 centuries, the Bank of England stood untouched, not just by time, but by scrutiny. It was more than a financial institution. It was a cathedral of credibility. Its stone facade whispered of empire. Its vaults guarded the wealth of nations, and its governors spoke with the quiet confidence of men who believed they were above question. Founded in 1694, the bank was born in the shadow of war, forged to fund the British Crown's ambitions. It grew not just in power, but in myth. Through revolutions, recessions, and the rise and fall of empires, it remained the one constant, the keeper of gold, the guardian of trust. Politicians came and went. Markets rose and crashed. But the bank endured, cloaked in prestige and protected by tradition. And yet, behind the marble and mahogany, something darker festered. The bank's leadership operated in a world of closed doors and coded language. Decisions were made in silence. Audits were internal. Transparency was a performance, not a principle. When questions arose about missing reserves, questionable transactions, or outdated testing methods, they were met not with answers, but with disdain. Secrecy wasn't a flaw. It was policy. In 2008, as global markets collapsed, the bank's role came under fire. Critics pointed to its failure to foresee the crisis, its cozy ties to private institutions, and its opaque emergency lending. But the backlash was brief. The bank, ever composed, weathered the storm with a familiar tactic: denial wrapped in decorum. Elitism wasn't just tolerated. It was celebrated. Governors spoke in riddles, their statements designed to confuse rather than clarify. The public, especially immigrants and working-class families, were told to trust, not to question. The pound was sacred. The vaults were secure. And anyone who doubted that was sacred. The vaults were secure. And anyone who doubted that was labeled a populist, a radical, or worse, an outsider. But cracks had begun to show. In 2016, a leaked memo revealed internal concerns about reserve purity. The document, buried under layers of bureaucracy, hinted at inconsistencies in gold testing, discrepancies that could undermine the bank's entire foundation. The leadership dismissed it as procedural noise. No investigation followed. No accountability was offered. Because denial wasn't a reaction. It was a reflex. The bank's arrogance wasn't loud. It was quiet, calculated, and deeply entrenched. It believed it could outlast scandal, outtalk critics, and outmaneuver truth. After all, who would dare challenge the institution that had shaped the financial DNA of the modern world? But arrogance has a shelf life. And when 100 tons of pure gold arrived in London, gold that gleamed brighter, weighed heavier, and tested cleaner, the illusion began to fracture. The public didn't just see a discrepancy. They saw betrayal. They saw a system that had asked for their trust and returned silence. And within the bank's own walls, one employee had seen too much. A vault inspector. Quiet, methodical, unassuming, but relentless. They had watched the tests, noticed the anomalies, raised the alarm. And when the leadership buried their concerns, they made a decision that would change everything. Because one whistleblower had seen too much and refused to stay silent. His name was Adil Khan. Born in Karachi, raised in East London, he knew what it meant to live between worlds. His parents had arrived with nothing but degrees and dreams, believing that hard work and honesty could carve a place in a country that didn't always welcome them. Adil believed it too. That belief led him to the vaults. He wasn't flashy. He didn't network. He didn't play politics. But he was precise. As a vault inspector for the Bank of England, Adil's job was simple: verify, record, report. Gold purity, weight, origin, every detail mattered. And he treated each bar like a sacred trust. Because to him, gold wasn't just metal. It was a promise. For years, he worked in silence. He watched governors come and go, watched policies shift, watched the institution wrap itself in prestige while quietly cutting corners. He noticed inconsistencies, bars that didn't match their certificates, weights that fluctuated, tests that were skipped. At first, he thought it was error. Then he realized it was design. He raised concerns. Quietly, respectfully. He submitted reports, flagged anomalies, requested retests. The response? A promotion freeze. A warning. A closed-door meeting where he was told, "This isn't your concern. Stay in your lane." But Adil didn't have a lane. He had a conscience. The more he saw, the more he understood. The bank wasn't just hiding mistakes. It was hiding deception. And when the shipment of 100 tons of pure gold arrived, gold that passed every test with flying colors, Adil saw his moment. Not to retaliate, but to reveal. He resigned the next day. No severance. No pension. No references. He walked away from the institution he had once revered, carrying nothing but a folder of test results and a fire in his chest. He contacted independent labs. He verified everything. He built a case not with outrage, but with evidence. And when he was ready, he didn't leak it. He stood before cameras, calm and clear, and told the truth. The backlash was immediate. The bank called him a disgruntled employee. Politicians dismissed him. Anonymous threats flooded his inbox. But something else happened too. Immigrant families saw him. Young professionals saw him. People who had been told to stay quiet saw him, and they listened. Because Adil Khan wasn't just exposing a scandal. He was reclaiming dignity. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply showed the numbers, the certificates, the discrepancies. And when he revealed the test results, the undeniable proof that the bank's reserves were not what they claimed to be, the room went silent. The boardroom was pristine. Polished wood, velvet chairs, portraits of governors past gazing down with colonial pride. But the silence was brittle. Adil Khan stood at the far end of the table, flanked by two independent analysts and a single microphone. Across from him sat the bank's top brass, suits stiff with discomfort, eyes darting, lips pressed into lines of denial. The live stream had just begun. Journalists packed the back wall, cameras rolling, fingers poised. Outside, thousands watched in real time. The headline had already gone viral. Whistleblower confronts Bank of England over fake gold scandal. Adil didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I submitted purity discrepancies in 2016. He began, his tone measured. They were ignored. I requested retests. Denied. I flagged inconsistencies in bar weights, origin stamps, and assay reports. I was told to stay in my lane. A murmur rippled through the room. The bank's chief compliance officer leaned forward, voice clipped. Mr. Khan, these accusations are inflammatory and unfounded. Our reserves are audited annually. Adil nodded. Yes. Internally. By your own team. Using outdated equipment. Without third-party oversight. The governor shifted in his seat. We stand by our reserves. Adil's eyes didn't flinch. Then why do they fail modern purity tests? The room froze. One of the analysts beside him held up a folder. We tested 10 randomly selected bars from the bank's vault. Not one met the 99.99% standard claimed. Some were as low as 92.3%. That's not a rounding error. That's fraud. Gasps. Cameras zoomed. The governor's face paled. The chief legal officer interjected. These tests are not sanctioned. They lack context. Adil stepped forward. Context. The context is this. The public trusted you. Immigrant families trusted you. Workers who gave their lives to this country trusted you. And you gave them gilded lies. The room erupted. Journalists shouted questions. Officials scrambled. The live stream chat exploded. Hashtags forming, memes already circulating. But Adil wasn't done. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. This, he said, is the full metallurgical breakdown. Certified. Independent. Undeniable. He placed it on the table, slid it toward the governor. And if you still claim your gold is pure, Adil said, voice steady, then you won't mind if we test every bar. Live. On camera. The room went silent. But the whistleblower wasn't done. They had brought proof. The envelope sat untouched on the table, its weight heavier than gold. Adil Khan didn't speak. He let the silence stretch, let the tension thicken like fog. The governor stared at it, hands folded, jaw clenched. Around the room, the air shifted from denial to dread. Adil finally broke the silence. These results, he said, are from 3 independent labs. One in Zurich, one in Dubai, one in Singapore. Each tested samples from the bank's vaults. Each used modern spectrometry. Each came to the same conclusion. He opened the envelope slowly, deliberately, and pulled out the first sheet. Bar number 1173, he read. Stamped as 99.99% pure. Actual purity, 93.4%. Bar number 1189, 91.7%. Bar number 1202, 89.2%. The lowest? 84.6%. Gasps rippled through the room. A journalist dropped their pen. A camera zoomed in. The governor's face drained of color. These aren't rounding errors, Adil continued. They're systemic misrepresentations. Your vaults aren't filled with gold. They're filled with gilded deception. The phrase hung in the air like thunder. The chief compliance officer leaned forward, voice trembling. We dispute these findings. Our internal audits are obsolete, interrupted one of the analysts. Your testing methods haven't changed in 20 years. You rely on surface readings. These labs used full spectrum analysis. They tested beneath the shine. Adil stepped aside as a screen flickered to life behind him. Images appeared, high-resolution scans of gold bars, annotated with purity levels, timestamps, and lab signatures. One showed a bar split open, its core visibly darker than its surface. This, Adil said, pointing, is what you've been calling pure. This is what you've been selling to governments, backing currencies, and presenting to the public. The governor tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Adil turned to the crowd. This isn't just a scandal. It's a breach of global trust. Nations store their reserves here. Investors hedge their futures here. And you've built it on a lie. The room erupted. Journalists shouted questions. Phones buzzed. Live stream chats exploded with hashtags. Hashtag fake goldgate. Hashtag gilded deception. Hashtag bank of shame. But Adil wasn't finished. He held up a final document. A sworn affidavit from a former bank metallurgist. She was instructed, he said, to adjust test results to match expected purity. When she refused, she was reassigned. Her affidavit confirms internal manipulation of data going back at least a decade. The governor stood, finally finding his voice. This is a coordinated smear campaign. We will investigate. Adil cut him off. You've had years to investigate. You buried reports, silenced staff, denied audits. And now, when the truth stands in front of you, you call it a smear. He stepped closer to the table, voice low but firm. You didn't just lie to economists. You lied to immigrants who trusted the pound. You lied to families who saved in good faith. You lied to a nation that believed in its institutions. The governor sat down. Adil turned back to the crowd. We're not asking for apologies. We're demanding accountability, full transparency, independent audits, and public acknowledgement of the deception. The room fell silent. And then, slowly, the applause began. It started with one journalist, then another, then the analysts, then the crowd outside, watching on screens. The sound grew, not loud, but steady. A ripple of validation. A wave of truth. Adil didn't smile. He didn't bow. He simply gathered his papers, nodded once, and walked out. But just when the bank thought it couldn't get worse, the public responded. The moment Adil Khan walked out of the boardroom, the internet detonated. Within minutes, hashtag gilded deception was trending in 20 countries. TikTok flooded with side-by-side comparisons of real gold versus the bank's diluted bars. Twitter turned savage. Memes of the governor holding chocolate coins, satirical videos of vaults filled with spray-painted bricks, and one viral clip of a toddler identifying purer gold than the bank's reserves. But it wasn't just jokes. It was fury. Progressive economists called for immediate audits. Financial watchdogs demanded resignations. Politicians who had long praised the bank's unshakable integrity now scrambled to distance themselves. In Parliament, a motion was introduced to freeze all gold-related transactions until independent verification could be completed. Celebrities joined the chorus. A-list actors posted solidarity messages with Adil. A Grammy-winning rapper dropped a freestyle titled Fool's Gold, calling out the elite for selling shine and calling it legacy. Influencers, activists, and immigrant community leaders flooded social media with one message: we trusted you. You lied. International banks began quietly reviewing their own reserves. The Swiss National Bank issued a statement of concern. The Reserve Bank of India requested a full audit of its holdings in London. Even the IMF hinted at systemic vulnerabilities in long-standing institutions. The ripple effect was global. But in Britain, the emotional fallout was personal. For immigrant families who had long been told to just trust the system, the scandal felt like a slap. The pound wasn't just currency, it was identity. It was the promise that hard work, sacrifice, and belief in the nation would be honored. And now, that promise lay tarnished. Protests erupted outside the Bank of England. Not massive, but symbolic. People held up signs reading "Real Gold, Real Truth," and "We are not your fool's gold." Adil's face appeared on murals, posters, and even T-shirts, not as a rebel, but as a reminder. Inside the bank, panic spread. Internal emails leaked. Staff morale collapsed. Rumors swirled of resignations, firings, and emergency meetings. The governor canceled public appearances. The official website went down for maintenance. But the damage was done. Because this wasn't just a scandal. It was a reckoning. And amidst the chaos, the hashtags, the headlines, the outrage, one message rose above the noise. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't trending. It was quiet, handwritten, and taped to the bank's front gate. It read, "We came here for truth. You gave us shine. But we still believe in gold, the kind that lives in people like a deal. The storm had passed, but its echoes remained. In the days following the scandal, Adil Khan didn't bask in fame. He didn't tour talk shows or chase headlines. He returned to the quiet rhythm of his life, the same modest flat, the same morning tea, the same walk through East London's patchwork of cultures and languages. But something had changed. People stopped him on the street, not with fanfare, but with gratitude. A nod from a bus driver, a whispered thank you from a grandmother in hijab, a hug from a teenager who said, "You made me believe we matter." Because Adil hadn't just exposed a lie. He had reminded a nation and a world that truth still had weight. The Bank of England launched an internal review. Governors resigned. Audits were ordered. But the real shift wasn't in policy. It was in perspective. For too long, institutions had measured value in bullion and balance sheets. Adil's act reframed the equation. Real value wasn't in gold. It was in honesty. It was in the courage to speak when silence was safer. It was in the dignity of standing alone, not for attention, but for principle. It was in the quiet conviction that truth, even when inconvenient, is the only currency that never devalues. Progressive voices rallied behind him. Immigrant communities held vigils, not in protest, but in pride. Schools taught his story. Artists painted his likeness. And in Parliament, a new bill was introduced, the Transparency Act, mandating independent audits for all national reserves. But Adil never claimed victory. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a citizen, one who had been given a job, saw a wrong, and chose to make it right. His final public statement was brief. "I didn't do this to shame anyone. I did it because I was taught that truth matters. My parents came here believing that. I still believe it." And that belief rippled outward. In Ghana, a journalist cited Adil's story while exposing corruption in their central bank. In Brazil, a student movement demanded transparency in public spending. In Pakistan, a young vault technician wrote, "If Adil can speak, so can I." The scandal had begun with gold, but it ended with something far more enduring. It ended with a reminder that justice isn't forged in vaults, but in voices. That dignity isn't stamped on bars, but carried in hearts. That accountability isn't a punishment, but a promise. And as the dust settled, as the headlines faded, one truth remained. In a world obsessed with wealth, it was truth that proved priceless. 100 tons of 99.99% pure gold didn't just roll into London. It rolled over the illusion of untouchable power. The Bank of England, once cloaked in prestige and secrecy, now stands exposed. Not by force, not by scandal-hungry media, but by one voice, one folder, one truth. This wasn't just about fake gold. It was about real courage. Adil Khan didn't just challenge an institution. He reminded us that transparency isn't a luxury, it's a right. That dignity isn't inherited, it's earned. And that no vault, no title, no legacy is immune to accountability. If this story moved you, if it made you question, reflect, or feel seen, then don't let it end here. Subscribe, share, talk about it. Demand audits in your own country. Ask who's guarding your future. Because silence protects power, but truth protects people. This isn't just a British story. It's a global wake-up call, and it's only just begun. Because if truth can shake the oldest bank in the world, imagine what it can do when we all stand for it.